So in this video, guys, we're going to be talking about the three really impactful and valuable tips on managing pre-diabetes or being diabetic, or maybe you're just thinking about or worried about diabetes because it runs in your family. I think this is going to be the most powerful video you watch on something like this. I'm going to talk about why in a second, but part of the reason is because I'm going to give you tips with more depth and meaning and more direction, which is the thing that we're lacking. Because when we think about how we get diagnosed with diabetes, you might go to the doctor, you might have a blood test, I think it's A1C, comes back high, and you're either pre-diabetic or you need to think about your blood glucose levels, or maybe you're diabetic. Now, this video is not medical advice, so whatever you're doing with your doctors, great, keep doing that. This is just meant to supplement that and give you more value and more direction. But the thing is, not to be judgmental of doctors, they are living their own lifestyles, but they are actually not the people that coach this stuff that you need to be good at in order to manage diabetes. You want to manage this nicely through lifestyle, because it's normally lifestyle problems that end up leading you to a diabetes 2 problem. Now, diabetes 2 is obviously different to diabetes 1. So diabetes 1 is where your pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin, whereas 2 is actually you become insulin resistant. And insulin, I'm sure you already know this if you're thinking about these things, but just to cover really generally in the next 2 minutes, insulin is the thing that pulls glucose out of your bloodstream. Now, if you become resistant, it just means that insulin is having more difficulty pulling that glucose out of your bloodstream. And the danger is to have too much glucose in your bloodstream. Obviously, too much rather than any, because you need some in your bloodstream, right? To give you energy, that's what it's for in the body, and to be used for synthesis and many of the things that go on in the body. So it's just the excess, and you're trying to get better at managing your insulin resistant and becoming less insulin resistant. So the insulin in your body is actually sufficient to do what it needs to do. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to give you 3 tips, but these tips are going to have more depth than what you get from a doctor, because at the end of the day, I coach this stuff. I coach nutrition, I coach movement, and I coach the things around it that are meant to be in your lifestyle in order for you to be good at managing your insulin resistance. Whereas the doctor is going to tell you to be good at these things, but in all honesty, in many of them themselves are not managing this. And who knows, they don't have a predisposition to it perhaps, maybe they're not struggling with it, but they know what you're meant to be doing. And often, so many of them, you probably realize, actually are not taking those actions themselves. The other thing I want to really cover here is the reason I got interested in talking about diabetes is, one, because I already coach this stuff, and I thought this is going to be way more value if I talk about it in the context of solving a problem and helping a particular group of people. And this really came to my attention for my own purposes and my own health when I learned 2 of my cousins were struggling with pre-diabetes. Now, these guys are not obese, and one of the factors and risk factors for diabetes is being overweight. And actually, I'm going to talk about something in a second that my doctor said to me that was really interesting before we get into these 3 tips. Don't worry, they're coming. But these of my cousins, both of them, they don't look overweight, but they do have a little bit more belly fat around the region. And there's something with ethnic minorities. You know, I'm of Asian Indian descent, and there's something with African and people of black origin that we have and may run a risk of being diabetic more than other groups. Something I want to look into is that we may already have a higher marker for something like A1C, which is measuring your blood glucose levels over the last 3 months, which I'm going to talk about separately once I've looked into in a different video. But we may already have a higher marker for this. But one of the interesting things the doctor said to me the other day when I went to the doctor and I was leaving, and I kind of asked a question around diabetes, obviously being more interested now that my 2 cousins have it, and also my 2 of my uncles have it. And the one thing I'll say is my uncles are probably a little bit more overweight. They also both are self-employed. One of them runs their own big company, and the other guy is an electrician. So they're really active. So once they got this diagnosis, they've been really active, walking a lot more, managing a stressful lifestyle. So look, the good news is you can do these things and have a stressful, or have something that you really need to do, like running your own business, which is not easy. But also at the same time, they're not stuck behind a desk at a laptop, which is going to increase your risks of something like type 2 diabetes. So have a think about that. How can you be more active? How does it fit into your lifestyle? And I would say one of them I have heard is not the best at managing it, although he's now into his, I think, early 80s. He eats sweet stuff more often than he should, and look, he's still doing okay. So at least the alarm bells are not massively ringing. But of course, I don't know what these 2 are doing on a daily basis. I don't know what other struggles they're living with. But there is obviously a health implication of having type 2 diabetes, So we want to be the best with our lifestyle. The other thing I want to say is I coach this stuff. So if you want any support, help, then please go and reach out to me via my website, because you're just going to have a lot more support and you're going to be way better at doing this stuff. The other thing I want to say is that people look at getting this diagnosis and then having to do these actions as a negative thing. But really, it's such an amazing thing, because you're going to start looking after your nutrition better, exercising better, looking after your sleep. And whilst initially these might feel like mental barriers or new things you have to do that you really don't want to, the thing you have to say and really believe is you're going to build a life of abundance, because looking after your nutrition is amazing. Even though you might have to give up these things that make you think you feel good, trust me, if it's done appropriately and properly, over time, a healthy diet feels amazingly good, better than eating all that other rubbish that you might be eating. Similarly with exercise, some people have an aversion to it to begin with. This is more psychological because of their past experiences. And that's because exercise is this amazing thing. When you do it, you get full of endorphins. It's actually something to easily become addicted to, and I'm probably more on that side of the scale. And this is why it's important, if you're struggling, to maybe work with someone who loves these things and can bring joy and enjoyment, manage these decisions, gives you more ideas of what to do and more direction. Because this is going to be a really amazing thing if you embrace this journey. You don't have to work with someone, you can do this yourself. All I'm saying is just make sure you embrace it, because it's going to be a really amazing thing to work on your health, and you're going to feel better mentally, and your type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, all that stuff is just going to be managed naturally, and you're going to have to think less about it, because your lifestyle is just going to become so healthy, it becomes a non-problem or a non-worry potentially. Obviously not if you have type 2 diabetes, you need to manage that really carefully in the way that you have to medically, but this is only going to support it, right? Finally, just before we jump into the tips, the thing that my doctor said to me when I walked into his office was that actually it might be more important to understand your waist should be half the length of your height. If it's half the length of your height, that's a good waist to height ratio for diabetes. Because when you fill and get this layer of fat around your abdominal region, it starts to encroach on the space of your liver, your pancreas, which produces insulin, and they become less efficient at doing this stuff. So actually belly fat region, he said, is potentially a better marker than some of these others for understanding your risk of diabetes. So if you're overweight, then you need to start to reduce that to reduce your risk. But at the same time, when I was talking about my cousins, both of them are not really obese in other parts of their body, but they are carrying more weight around their waist. There may be a genetic predisposition to this, but at the end of the day, if you have it, you need to manage it. So diving into these two tips, and tip number one is just going to be understanding your nutrition and carbohydrate intake better. And whilst that might seem like really standard tip or advice, we're going to dive a little bit deeper, and that's what this video is really about. At the end of the day, I coach this stuff, and I know that people who think they understand carbohydrates really don't. You may think rice, pasta, I don't know, wheat flour, all these other things, fruits, they have carbs in them. But actually getting into the nitty gritty is where people don't really realize. And if you're struggling with something like pre-diabetes or being diabetic, then you really need to get down into the detail. And once you do, you can step away, because your understanding is going to be so much better. For instance, when I was on a keto diet, I am trying to minimize the amount of carbohydrates I was eating. It was a real eye-opener to see where carbohydrates were sneaking into my diet. Eating something like a Greek yogurt in the morning, which is, high fats, high protein, you wouldn't necessarily associate with carbohydrates, but actually it was giving me quite a decent amount of carbohydrates in the morning. And at the end of the day, all this is doing is increasing my knowledge of how I'm managing carbohydrates. If you're type 2 diabetic, you might be injecting yourself with insulin, and it's dependent on how many carbohydrates you eat. I believe it's a calculation. So again, it's going to be really pivotal to understand these things. And the way to which to do this is to use a calorie tracking app. They're really easy to use. I've got other videos, and make sure you read the notes in the description of this video, because I'm going to put links to other videos that I think will be really useful. I talked about the calorie tracking app that I use, which is Chronometer. You can also use another one if you like a user-friendly one called Lose It. I think Chronometer is user-friendly, and it's an amazing, useful app. And the website is also really good, so you can use your phone and the website. The thing it does, and it's really easy, is you can scan barcodes. If you're eating processed food, you're going to eat more, be scanning more barcodes. As you clean up your diet, you're going to be weighing food. So the two things you need is a phone to have this app on, and a weighing scale so you can weigh your food. but your knowledge is going to increase, and it's really easy to actually use these things. I used to use an Excel spreadsheet, and I've been converted now because these apps are so good to actually use those. So start using a calorie tracking app to understand your intake. And I've done another video on the good things around trying to manage your calories, trying to use an app. So I'm going to link that here if you want to go and see that. At the end of the day, use one. I've recommended 2 here. And by doing so, you're going to start to really understand where you're eating carbohydrates, and also understand your reaction to different types of carbohydrates, because we're sensitive in different ways. You might find rice really triggers your carbohydrate intake and you can feel it in your body, whereas something else like flour or bread maybe might not so much. At the end of the day, you want to understand carbohydrates in detail and which foods they're coming from and how you're eating them. The best way to do that, if you are concerned about these things, there's no doubt, is to get a calorie tracking app on your phone and measure out all the stuff that you're going to do. One more tip on this is to eat more regular, similar meals so you don't have to keep using this app. Or actually measuring it's easier because you're starting to build up your mental knowledge of how many carbs are in these things. And then you can do it more intuitively, and you don't always need the app. The app is just there to build up your knowledge in the beginning of understanding carbohydrates, which is the most pivotal thing when it comes to type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetic, and being worried about this stuff. Tip number 2 is actually going to be split into 2, but it's to be really on top of the mechanisms of glucose getting into your bloodstream. And tip number 1 is going to be linked to number 1, which is understanding nutritional intake. If you layer your carbohydrates, say for instance eating proteins, fats and fibers before or maybe with some carbohydrates, it slows down the absorption of carbohydrates. Now, if the problem that we have with type 2 diabetes is too much glucose hitting the bloodstream too quickly, then of course slowing down the digestion of carbohydrates into the bloodstream is only going to put less pressure on your insulin resistance, your body, and everything's going to happen more slower. So this is a really crucial tip. Start to layer your food. Don't have carbohydrates, fruits, anything else on an empty stomach. Start to think about having your proteins first, your fats first, and then think about having it with fiber potentially when you have fruit. Actually, it's less dangerous than having something like just raw sugar, because fruits have some fiber which slows down the absorption of that type of glucose. The second part, tip number 2, is go for walks straight after you eat. And this is because as soon as you eat, there's some digestion going on and carbs digest pretty quickly. Now, if you are getting glucose into the bloodstream, your body needs to do something with that. So by going for a walk, walks are often associated with becoming better at insulin resistance, but you also are telling your body you're using this energy. So some of this energy is being utilized. And we're going to talk about this in more detail in terms of storage in tip number 3, but you're using some of this energy up. So your body's pulling glucose out of the bloodstream. It's also being used up. So this mechanism of pull out of the bloodstream and use up is working really well. Whereas if you're just going down and lying down, as you often want to, you feel like if your food was too carb heavy, then you're going to lie down. Your body's going to be pulling glucose out of the bloodstream, turning it into fat, or maybe storing it if there is storage places for it. And it's just like a weaker mechanism. It just makes sense, right? So those are your 2 tips for tip number 2. Walk after your meals. You're going to feel much better for it. You're going to store less fat. And this is obviously all overall going to reduce your type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes risks, and just generally manage glucose better. And layer your food. So don't be having carbohydrates on an empty stomach. And that means actually having regular meals. Often it's the things like carbohydrates we reach for when we are really snacky or really hungry. That's the thing you don't want to do. So have your go-to meals like yogurt with something else in there, or proteins, or nuts and seeds, all these things, because you're then just not shoveling glucose into your mouth and into your bloodstream. Now, tip number 3 is an interesting one. Most people with type 2 diabetes, glucose, weight loss, whatever, don't understand glucose that well. And we have 2 primary places that we store glucose in the body. One is the liver. It's really stored there quite densely, because we have functions in the body that rely on glucose, and the liver can release that glucose if it's running low in the bloodstream. We also store glucose in our muscles. So there's about 100 grams, depending on your size and weight, that's stored in the liver, and there's about 400 stored in the rest of the body, 400 to 500 in your muscles. Now, glucose, in terms of energy, 1 gram of glucose is 4 calories or kilocalories. So if you store 400 grams, or let's say let's say 400 grams in your muscles, and we store, let's say, 100 grams in your liver, that's 500. So that means at any one time you store about 2,000 calories of carbohydrates in your body. That's why if you fast, you hear about being in keto within a few hours or however many hours. By 24 hours, you may have used up all the carbohydrates you store, a lot of them at least. But fat is different. You store fat that you really could survive for like days, months, weeks. Definitely more than days for most people, and definitely a few weeks at least for most people without eating at all. So that's the mechanism of carbohydrates. Now, of course, if you are lower in muscle mass, you have less storage sites, which puts more pressure on your body when it's pulling glucose out of the body to do something else with it rather than just storing it in your muscles. So tip number 3 is to start to build more muscles. The more muscles you have, the more metabolically healthy you get, the less insulin resistance you might be, and generally healthy. So start to work on building muscle. And one tip I'm going to give you here, and watch another video I'm going to link here for just 3 exercises you can start doing, is focus on some place. It's really easy to say start exercising, but if you haven't, oh my god, the options are massive. But your legs are a massive muscle group, so it's often a good place to start. You can train them quite often, and at the end of the day, if you're trying to build muscle, why not build the biggest muscle group for storage, right? So go check out that video, but start doing leg exercises. That could be your place to start. And I think the other place to start, which kind of builds into my philosophy of when I coach people, is to go and lift weights. Everyone knows how to do bicep curls, and if you don't, go look up a video or check out some of my other workouts and routines and do more of them. But start with legs. Start building your legs, your glutes, your quads. These are big muscle groups, and in that video I focus on these primarily because they're useful for other things than just doing muscles, just used functionally in your everyday life. So go check out that video, start there, and then build your biceps because they're good for aesthetics. And look, at the end of the day, this journey needs to be enjoyable and motivational. So if you start seeing muscle growth in places that are kind of aesthetically pleasing, like your biceps, it's quite likely you're going to get back into the gym again and do that again. And the same with legs. Some people want biceps, some people want to start building their bum, some people want nice quads or legs. Think about these things, start building them out, and it's only going to get better for your insulin resistance. I'm going to give you one more bonus tip, but like I said, guys, as a quick reminder, I do coach this stuff. So if you need help, just reach out, because like I said, often working with someone who loves this stuff is infectious, and this is what you want to be doing. So whether you do it with someone or you do it by yourself, pick things you enjoy. There's many different ways of exercising, and I use many different modalities: weights, body weight, calisthenics, gymnastics, Pilates there in the world. I don't do that too much. Yoga, like all these different things. You want a little bit of both, where it's just mentioning yoga is not the best at building muscle, but it is a good form of exercise. Go and do stuff that you enjoy and start integrating this into your lifestyle so it becomes less effort and more reward, and you live a better life of abundance. The last and bonus tip I'm going to give you here is actually to do with storage around your belly region. Now, you might have a pre-genetic disposition to this. A lot of men tend to store more fat around the abdominal region. I think for women it's more around their hips and legs. But at the end of the day, there's another factor that plays a really crucial role in this, and that's cortisol. So when you are stressed, your body releases hormones, chemicals. One of them is called cortisol. And what this does is it tells your body that there's some sort of stress going on, and your body responds in a way that it thinks is useful. And back in the day, maybe a form of stress would be starvation. So your body starts to think, okay, we're going to potentially be deprived of calories in the future. We need to store more calories, and it stores it around the vital organs so that it's there ready when needed. So you start to store visceral fat, you start to store fat around your abdominal region for a purpose of starvation in the future. But at the end of the day, in this day and age, most of us living in cities and places have food in abundance, and this is not a useful mechanism. So yes, it's really easy to start managing your stress better, but understanding that is actually a key concept in trying to understand how you're going to reduce your belly fat in that region. Now, you don't want to stress about stress, so just understanding that doesn't mean you now stress about when you're stressed. But something you could do straight away, immediately, is to go and write down areas of your life that you feel stressed in, and then actually write next to them which, in the short term, you can actually manage and change. Maybe you can't change your job, maybe you can't change the people managing you that stress you out, but maybe you can sleep better, and you can focus on other health metrics that I tend to talk about, when you can't focus on the psychological stresses, or maybe you do both. And that would be, for one, eating cleaner. Everyone can eat cleaner, and you think about doing that, because there is something called nutritional stress when you eat too much processed food, too much sugars, high caffeine. All this stuff is ramping up your nervous system, also giving your body way more toxins to deal with and get rid of. That's a stress for your body. The other thing is with exercise. You may exercise too much, you may exercise too often, or you might do too much high intensity exercise, which means you are stressing your nervous system out all the time. Your cortisol levels are skyrocket high on top of psychological stress you get from work. And this is one of the other things I coach, which is trying to manage people back out of burnout. Because often we are kind of burning things at both ends, working out because we have this mentality of burnout mentality of just doing too much, working really hard, and just doing way too much all the time. So the thing I want to mention here is find your areas that you're going to focus on, and that might be exercise, that might be nutrition, sleeping better. They're all going to impact your stress. And maybe you can work on other aspects of stress where you actually have more control. That's it for this video. Look, I hope these 3 tips / 4 tips have been really useful. I think they really are the most powerful tips you can have at the start of starting to deal with prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, is getting unbelievable control and understanding over glucose, which is the problem. Starting to think about delaying and how your body mechanisms work in digesting it. And then number 3, increasing the storage sites in your body so you can work alongside this issue you're having. And then number 4, reduce stress, because it's going to have so much benefit, not just the visceral fat around your waist, a huge amount else. This is a holistic problem, and you can go about it in a holistic way. So I hope this has given you some depth. Don't bite off too much too quickly. Start small, make it enjoyable, and see how you go.